Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here again after yesterday's seminar. Yesterday we introduced the topic thinking outside the box with the director of the STEAM room, Camilla Chalmers. Today we are pleased to welcome two new speakers. The first is Professor Johan Gielis, a very special guest from Antwerp. And the second is Professor Claudio Veneri, our colleague at UCAM. Professor Gielis is a mathematician with a background in botany. He is a great example of interdisciplinary researcher. He wrote many papers in geometry, plants, and biotechnology application. He invented or discovered, it depends on whether you consider mathematics, the superformula that is transformation. I read his astonishing book, The Geometrical Beauty of Plants, about the study of natural shapes. Today, he will share his expert opinion on creative and interdisciplinary thinking in the field of geometry, with the seminar Geometrical Glasses and Lenses. With that, I ask you to give a full attention to Professor Gielis and help me welcome him to the virtual conference room. Professor Gielis, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Simone. It is my pleasure. So, if anything is unclear or you don't see my slides, just let me know.
Yes, of course.
In preparing the presentation, the question of Simone was on creativity. So I made the lecture a bit different from what I tell normally, and I focused a bit on geometrical glasses and lenses. So the two books that I published, two among others, are one in 2003 and the other one in 2017. And in the middle, you see gas clouds in the universe on the left, and you see flowers, details of flowers on the right. So in the whole of let's say natural science, from very small to the very large, we see very similar structures. And my goal or my life work is in searching for unity in diversity. So there are 5 subjects in my talk. So I will explain a bit about universality, creativity, clarity, and transversality. Because of the nature of the talk on creativity and transversality, I will talk a bit about my background. So that's actually, I don't have a degree in mathematics, but I do have a degree in plant biotechnology. Later I got a PhD, but so I did not have a formal training. So that came later. I'll talk about my own work and how we can, in the simplest way, try to represent phenomena and shapes in natures. And that raises, I will answer a few questions, but there will be more questions afterwards. And I will give some very specific way of looking at things beyond the classical, more Euclidean way we look. But I would like to start in the sense of creativity and transversality. An observation by a famous geometer, William Thurston. So he says, well, and I completely agree with this, human understanding does not follow a single path. It's not a computer with a central processing unit. Our brains are much more complex and capable of far more than a single path. And therefore, he says, it's also very important that the way we do mathematics and the way we do natural sciences is kept as a kind of history, and we understand how difficult it is to come to certain insights. Otherwise, if we look only at the mental concepts, then everything is reduced to a formal scheme. Geometers call this the more Babylonian way of doing mathematics. So another famous geometer from Romania says, if mathematics is torn from its foundation, it will become a series of formulae, recipes, and tautologies, which could no longer be replied to some objective reality, but only to some rigid, mortified scheme of this reality. It's very important to understand that what we are doing is developing mathematics or developing models of the world. And we are inspired by this world, but we are also, that puts also in a bit of an awkward position. But we should, as mathematicians or natural scientists, it is very important to understand that there is a behind all this, with failures, but also with successes. The most famous mathematicians from Russia in the 20th century was Vladimir Arnold. And he said, well, our brain has two halves. One is responsible for multiplication of polynomials and languages, and the other half for orienting ourselves in space and all things important in life. Mathematics is geometry, he says, when you have to use both halves. He's a very inspiring, you can find some of his writings online easily, Vladimir Arnold, very sharp observer. One of my favorite lines is, complex models are rarely useful, only for those writing dissertations. I thought it would be the right audience to this quote today. So when I spoke with Simone, there were three things, which is creativity, try to see how you can think outside of the box. But I've spent most of my life, or all of my life, in private companies, and you have to always be clear. You have to, it's not, you work with different people, you work with different backgrounds, different cultures. For example, in our antenna company, we have 35 people, and I think 26 or so nationalities. So you have to be clear. Clarity is very important. And transversality is also very important, and it could be that transversality is also transversal skills. Transversality is actually a mathematical term which says, it talks about not how spaces meet like tangents, but how spaces intersect. So in this case, various cultures, various ways of thinking intersect. And I would try to convey a bit of this way of thinking through geometrical glasses and lenses. Now, I have to go back in time because my work did not start in mathematics, not at all. I'm actually a plant biologist, worked for 25 years in plant biotechnology, and I focused mainly on bamboo. Bamboo is a fantastic plant, a multi-purpose plant, over 100 different uses, 1,000 different uses. Renew all that. What I developed in my time, in my 25 years, was a highly efficient method of propagation. This is called micropropagation. It's done in a lab. But what was very interesting is that we managed to get a system which is 98 to 100% perfect. If you, for example, I tell my students, if you have a rooting percentage of, say, 70% or 80%, that's not good enough. So you have to go to 100%, because if you transplant 5 million plants, you don't want to lose 1 million. So the success has to be as high as possible. And the only way to do this was through fundamental research. So we spent a great deal of my years in plant biotechnology, in studying the plant physiology, plant hormones, molecular biology, DNA markers, and so on and so forth. So fundamental research has always been at the foundation of my work in what would be called engineering. And this led to let's say, being on top of, let's say, the best company in the world for bamboo production. So just to let you know that my background is not in mathematics, but also in botany, but applied botany. How do you produce? And how do you produce in an optimal and highly efficient way? So, but then I moved after publishing my findings in mathematics. I came in contact with Diego Caratelli, who graduated in Rome, and we founded together antenna company. For Diego, antennas are something technological, but for me, everything is an antenna. A flower is an antenna. Our let's say the cell wall is an antenna. Soap bubbles are antennas, and so that's why we founded together, let's say, antenna company, and now we are 35 people. So my background and my expertise is a bit broad, focusing from very fundamental research to really products and so on. But I wanted to start also with something when I teach classes to biotechnology students who like to solve problems in medicine, for example, and who think that genes will be the future, gene action and gene modification and so on. And that certainly helps. My challenge to students was, how can you double the yield of rice? So an extra challenge is you have to do it in a sustainable way. So I also told them, think outside of the box. Don't think in terms of genetic engineering or in terms of breeding and so on. How can you do it? And this is a very tricky question, because if you talk about breeding and if you talk about genetic engineering, you could only get maybe 5% increase of yield of rice. So the question is, how do you double it? So I didn't get, in the first year, I didn't get too many good answers, let's say. The second year, they knew what the answer would be. And that is to be surprised, because this already was done. And the reason why I tell this was, it was found in a school in Madagascar, where there was a Jesuit priest, and he was working with students from 12 to 13 years old, trying to teach them agriculture. And they had made a mistake at some point. So you see on the upper right, IRRI, this is International Rice Research Institute, and they have recommendations how to plant. So, but the students made a bit of a mistake. And normally you should maybe talk to the students, but the father, the Jesuit, saw that this was remarkable, because normally, according to the rules of IRRI, you had to transplant, say, rice seedlings after 2 weeks or 3 weeks or later. But they picked up the seedlings only after 8 to 12 days. And it turned out to be a massive success. And over a course of 20 years, it was developed only in the early 1990s. They managed to develop a full system which went against the IRRA recommendations completely. It was a completely sustainable thing. There was no real science involved, in the sense there was no university involved, but still they managed to increase rice yields from 2 tons per hectare to 10, 12, or even 14 tons per hectare. This is not even doubling, this is so much more. System was developed slowly through farmer experimentation, changing water applications, techniques, crop spacing, and so on. And what was remarkable there, it was done in Madagascar, and then it was rolled out all over the world. There's a website at Cornell University now pointing this out. And again, some professors like Professor Uphoff helped in rolling this out to other countries. But actually, it was done on the ground, not by scientists, but by, let's say, a teacher and his students and farmers. So it's very important to understand that not everything of innovation gets into university, and get most remarkable results in another way. So here there's in the middle, there's the standard methods, and the SRI methods are on the right. So they're completely different. But I have to make one comment here, is that actually the standard methods, they fed you're all young people, but actually in the 20th century, we grew from 1 or 2 billion to 7 billion people. So feeding the world was possible through what is called the Green Revolution. in which fertilizers and herbicides were very important, and insecticides. So, but now we have been learning, and we are now moving into leading the world in a. And this particular SRI example is a very good example of how you could think outside of the box. Okay, so that's one example that I showed. So I think for me it's a very important example because it goes against the grain. And most of my life I've been doing that, very often to the chagrin of my employers or others. But anyway, so in the first talk, I will talk a bit about my own work. So how I got there and what we are doing and what we have been doing in the past 20 years. So if you look at scientific methods that we have from geometry, the main tools are straight lines and circles. They're exemplified in differential geometry by tangents and by oscillating curves. How stupid is it if we want to study starfish or squares on the base of a circle? Wouldn't it be better to do that in the base of the? Why should the starfish not be the unit? And if we do that, we find a common measure for squares or starfish. And the third challenge again. Can it be expressed in a simple way? Can it be analogous to the Pythagorean theorem? And yes, the answer is yes. And in the next 30 minutes or so, I will show many examples of how we could do that. So basically, my work started in bamboo, but bamboo was also the source of inspiration for this paper, A Generic Geometric Transformation, which unifies a wide range of natural and abstract shapes. It was published as an invited special paper in the American Journal of Botany in 2003. And the idea is now that you can really describe pentagonal, triangular, flower shapes, diatomic shapes, just as one formula. In the beginning, it got, actually, I have to say that it attracted a lot of attention in Italy. So in 2003, there were a few websites that published it, La Natura in una Superformula, or some other websites in Matematicamente and so on that used it. And over the years, that developed in various collaborations in Italy, in mathematics, physics, antennas, materials, biology, also education, I might ask, with Professor Ricci. He has mathematics. I had several talks in universities in Italy, amongst others in Napoli, and that evolved into collaboration with biologists and a physicist. Collaborations, for example, antennas, so on. And it's very remarkable that in Italy you have a very, very rich tradition in mathematics, starting with Archytas of Tarente, Pythagoras, and Archimedes. And yeah, that continues up to these days. So I'm glad I can collaborate with Italians. So, but also it's getting more traction, also not only in mathematics and science, but also outside. So in 2018, there's in the University of Basilicata, there's a series of 23 artworks by Salvatore Sebaste about the mathematics and the origin of mathematics and the history of mathematics. He makes artworks about Gauss and so on, about the first bone that was traced back in Africa that has traces of mathematical activity in humans. And one of his works was also the Superformula. There's one in Milan and there's also one in Basilicata. So it's getting broader and broader traction also outside of science. Now, talking about my own work, so it started in bamboo. So tropical bamboos can be 30 meters tall. They're hollow. The material is extremely light. and they can withstand tropical storms and so on. It's really a remarkable material. It's a remarkable structure. And I always wanted to find out what makes this so special. Have cylindrical combs, but there are a few that have square bamboos they're called, and they have both the inside and the outside of the shape is more squarish. This is Schimona bambusa quadrangularis, but on the right you see the same in a Dendrocalamus strictus, very large comb of 30 meters tall. The inside is something between a circle and a square. Now, at that time in the 80s, when I was trying to look for mathematical methods, there was a lot about elliptic Fourier, like you would be using to decompose or construct sound waves. So using Fourier series, or there was a huge buzz about fractals and all that. But I came across a mathematical equation, which is also known from the last theorem of Fermat, but it was actually developed in full by French mathematician Gabriel Lamé. And the equation is x to the n plus y to the n is r to the n. If n is 2, you have a circle. But if n is 0.5 or 2 or 1000, you can have anything between the axis, and you can just imagine like inflating a balloon in a box. Something like that. And then all these intermediate shapes can be described by this single formula. Now, Gabriel Lamé, and I don't expect that many of you heard the name of Gabriel Lamé, but back in the 19th century, he was considered as one of the most influential and best mathematicians in France and in Europe. And he was working in the École Polytechnique in Paris, dreaming of a unifying science. How do you best fit a coordinate system to the physical system? So not starting from a predefined coordinate system and then try to do all tricks like they do today in technology, but well, can we fit the best possible coordinate system to the shape itself and then solve the boundary value problems? This is completely in the tradition of Laplace. Now, when I started looking at these square bamboos, then described by this single shape, then you start to see these shapes everywhere. There's a huge number of plants that have square stems. You have square fruits. You have even in galaxies. A remarkable galaxy was reported in 2012, rectangular looking. So you find this. So let's go back to these shapes are called super circles. And if you have a long and a short axis, like in super ellipses, you have also a long and a short C-major and C-minor axis in ellipses. Then you have an extra factor. So just imagine that you can morph continuously a circle into a square or an ellipse into a rectangle. You can also imagine that being done in 3D, and then you morph basically a cube, a sphere into a cube, or an ellipsoid into a beam. Now here the question was, can we apply Lamé's idea to other symmetries? But because if you look in a Cartesian way, the circle is x squared plus y squared equals r squared. For a supercircle, Lamé, it's x to the n plus y to the n is r to the n, using absolute values to keep the figure closed. In the center below, you see what happens if you generate different exponents for n. And in 1997, a student of mine and myself, we transformed it into polar coordinates. Because this in Cartesian coordinates, we had to use gamma function and all that, and it seemed to us simpler in polar coordinates. And if you take n is 2, then you have on the left also the equation of a circle, because cosine squared plus sine squared equals 1. What I did then, the next step was I generated the superformula. We do it for pentagons or triangles, the same squares. And the remarkable thing was that adding m divided by 4 in the same equation just did the trick. And the exponents n1, n2, and n3, you see, just gave a bit more playground. And I also realized that it can be used not only as a transformation on a circle, a unit circle here, but it could be also as a transformation on planar functions. And that's why mathematicians call it Hillis transformations. Now, how does this work? So, for example, if you could have, this is the formula, and if f theta is a constant function like a circle, you can play around. If you fill in 3, for example, you can have shapes like this. If you fill in 5 or 6 or 7, you can have shapes like this. Just by playing with n2 and n3, you can get, as we will see, starfish starting from a circle. If f theta is an logarithmic spiral or an Archimedean spiral, you can also moderate these. If f theta is some cosine function, a trigonometric function, this is the classical way of viewing, let's say, trigonometric functions as a wave. But actually, I prefer, and that's the same, I prefer to look at them as flowers with my botanical background, of course. And we'll come back to these trigonometric functions. Now, that was remarkable because all of a sudden we could, all these shapes which previously had been different, we could just capture them in one shape. And then throughout the years, it has been also appeared in books and publications and presentations by others. For example, in Croatia on the left, Matematica de Pertuto was by Professor Bruno D'Amore in Bologna. And then in 2018, I was a guest at the Teachers Conference, and Professor Brandi and Salvadori from Perugia University gave a presentation. And so we now see more and more applications in science, education, and technology. What was most important for geometers like Professor Vestrala was that it's really a unifying description. So geometrical descriptions of curves and surfaces and the shapes that are derived via these transformations describe and determine in a uniform and universal way an enormous diversity of natural shapes. For example, you have square. If you fill in 5, you have a starfish. But actually, you have 5 angles, but they close in one rotation. If you say m is 5/2, you have 5 angles, but they close in 2 rotations. So you can also use rational numbers, you can use irrational numbers there. And you see absolutely, this is strawberry, these are succulent flowers, these are, say, mollusks, this is a fossil. You see the remarkable correspondence of these shapes with natural shapes, which was very pleasing, of course. Then we started to think, how can we do this in 3 dimensions? And it turned out to be that it was not that much more difficult, because if you think about the circle, you think about the circle as in a kinematic way. You take a circle and you revolve it around half a circle. You take half a circle and you revolve it around a circle, and then you have a sphere. But we thought of this differently. So if you take a sphere and you cut it through the center, if you circle, and you cut it in a perpendicular plane, then it will also give it. So you have 2 circles. But if you do that for a cube and you cut it through the center, so perpendicularly to the sides, let's say, parallel to the sides, then you have a square, and also in the other direction you have a square. So you have 2 squares. So this row 1, if this is a square, you have a cube. If this is a triangle and this is, let's say, or this could be a pentagon and this could be a rectangle, you get these shapes. So in 3 dimensions, it was not very much different. And for example, your one section could be a small circle, and then you get something like toroids. We also twisted the 3 dimension, which gave you helixes or knots or toroidal structures and so on. As we look back at the formula, in most cases you have one basically only about if you take the f theta to be a circle, you're talking only about 3 parameters different. So in these cases, in all these cases, you have 3 plus 3, which gives you So you get really complex structures like this just by playing around with 5 or 6 different parameters. And these shapes really, they only have different, but the mathematical expression is really the same. So we will be forced to rethink what complex or simple is. In the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, we established the first company to look at computer graphics. And so we developed, say, a prototype computer-aided design tool, CAD tool, to make planes, to make trains, to make shapes, and so on. And it also contained, I must say, it contained also an engineering part, but also a surprise part. So in this case, for example, there's a software with the surprise part. So you said, well, I want the computer to generate some data. Then it generates also a shape based on some random choice of the exponents. In the case of engineering, you don't want this randomness, but you have to have more control. But actually, also people also started building, let's say, structures like this with 250 of these super shapes, like a simple super shape. But what is very important, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but if you look at the shape like this, you describe the boundary. But if you look at the formula itself, this describes the boundary. But if you take smaller than or equal to, you describe everything in between. In the zero, everything light blue is also described. So it's also not only about boundaries, but also you can describe annuli or shells and also disks in the same way. And this allows us to describe everything inside as well. And we define potential fields in any way that we want, stress fields, electromagnetic fields, and so on. In this case, we started out from, let's say, more spherical coordinate systems, normal polar coordinate systems, but you could also think about cylindrical coordinate systems. For example, cacti. Looked at, for example, starfish. If you want to describe the shape of this starfish, with, for example, Fourier series, we'll give an example later. There's going to be a very complicated structure. But here we change only 1 or 2 numbers. So, but to go from the upper left to the lower right, we can describe different species or different individuals from one species. Or we can say this develops from very small to very large rescales. And actually, the only thing we want to do is change 1 or 2 numbers. It's like a slider bar, and then your shape grows. I will later in the geometrical lenses section, I will talk about congruence, because normally you would think if I translate this to this, these shapes are not congruent in the classical Euclidean way. But if we think in the English transformation way, they are congruent. And we Gabriel Lamé had in mind. So can we develop coordinate systems adapted to the shape? Yes, we can. Shape-specific coordinates. We can do it for creatures great and small. On the upper row in the middle, you see viruses, not corona ones in this case. And on the left, you see, I think it's a protein. And on the right, you see a projection of DNA. Living and non-living, here are in the middle, you see examples of square bacteria and ice snowflakes on the right. Yesterday and tomorrow, so you can have a look at fossils, triangular fossils. And remarkably, if you think in this way, you look very different to very shapes that are unexplained today in nature. So what was very important for the geometers as such was an effective approach geometrically to deal with one of the global anisotropies in many forms that do occur in nature, and with repeated local deviations, as deviations from Euclidean perfection, consists in applying these transformations to the basic shapes. And now we think with the geometers that there are 2 basic shapes in nature. There's in the list of references, there's a paper which details this. you have either the circle as a basic shape or the logarithmic spiral. And that's associated, of course, with logarithmic functions in the second case and with constant functions in the first case. And then if you apply the transformations to this, you can describe the widest range of shapes. Now, since the original publication, so yeah, well, that's was for sure thinking outside of the box, because it was something completely new. But in the past 15 years, we have seen many applications in many fields. So from the original paper, we found more than 500 citations today. And it's remarkable that these are very roughly, broadly defined fields. But in mathematics and geometry, we find 66 publications. That was in December. Now there are already 3+. We find it in biology. We find in physics and applied physics combined almost 60 papers today. And it goes from quantum to nanophotonics, nanotech. In electronics, for example, we have more than 80 papers today. And what is very common to all these things is that if you think about a computer graphic system or a drawing system, you can typically choose from a library. You can choose a cylinder, you can use a sphere or something, or you can use a square or a triangle. But in this case, they are considered as very different. And now we have a continuous transformation which can generate all this diversity of shapes. And that is very important, because what we see more and more, and what we already have applied for 5 years, the past 5 years in antennas, is normally you take a fixed shape and you try to compute something. So electromagnetic charge or whatever, or stresses or something. But here the shape itself becomes part of the optimization problem. So in this case, you could use, for example, particle swarm optimization or genetic algorithms to find the best possible shape. And that's being done, for example, in heat shields of rockets, or for example, in turbines for windmills and so on. People are trying to get away from this deadlock of having only circles and squares to start with, all the shapes they have tried 20 years ago. But now the shape itself becomes part of the optimization. And that's very important. And you see that also in psychology. So for example, previously in psychology, people would do, in our worldview, we consider a circle and a square as very different, completely opposite, but they're actually continua. You can continuously deform one into the other. And so in psychology also, before they had, so here you have a circle and here we show you a sphere, what do you like most? And now they have also a continuous way of looking at it. You can have many inter shapes in between. And so now many publications, more than 30 publications, have tried to capture brain activity and so on when people see intermediate shapes. So it's let's say getting distributed worldwide and in many different fields. That's what I said before. Technological applications. For example, if you go into Adobe Illustrator or some computer graphics program, you have shapes that you can choose like this. But anyway, millions and zillions shapes that you can really speed up design processes like this. So if you're looking for a new logo and you have to try to design something, shapes like this will generate it in a minute or seconds. As I said, in Antenna Company, we have been using it with Diego Caratelli in optimization. For example, here's one example for, we talk today very often about millimeter wave antennas. In this case, it was a 60 gigahertz lens antenna. And by using let's say our computational tools, inside of the best program that we know, CST microwave, we reduce our computational time by 60 or 80%. We needed only 10% or 20% of the memory. And we also found that our accuracy of computed versus measured was, let's say, much better. And that translates itself in faster design cycles, faster, more accurate computations, lesser design cycles, and so on, less hardware, less software licenses needed. So, and that's how we built, for example, an antenna company. And antennas just look like this. So this was an antenna on the left, and in the center was an antenna published in December 2020 by a group in Bari, University of Bari. On the right were antennas made at Antenna Company. So, but it doesn't stop there. We also have, let's say, you can use it for metamaterials. Metamaterials are materials which are supposed not to exist in nature. They were developed or conceived in the 1960s by a Russian, Victor Veselago. What is interesting is that the permittivity and the permeability, which together determine the refractive index, can be both negative, which means a reversal of Snell's law. And in this case, for example, you can, these are two examples, you can, in between two antennas, for example, you can put an electromagnetic band gap, and then you isolate the antennas completely, because this electromagnetic band gap just picks up the unwanted frequencies, attenuates them big time. On the right, for example, you see the other one. These are split ring resonators, and it's just an example, because in electronics, if you want to go in lower frequencies, you have to increase the size of your device. But by, for example, making a super shape here in the upper right, you can make the parameter longer than this one. So you can shift in frequency by keeping the same size of your. So anyway, so these are some examples of how we use it in Antenna Company. There are others, like in nanotechnology, for example. The left one was a very example. So gold particles to attack cancer, published by Professor Sanchez Gil in Madrid. Normally, these particles are supposed to be spherical, gold particles, and they heat up tumors. But they found that if the shapes are made differently, like, for example, like with the Superformula, then the heat transfer to the tumor was 10 times more efficient. Others have used it to optimize lasers and printing and so on and so forth. So it's being branched out in many ways. But I told before that flowers and waves are, whether you talk about electromagnetics or sound, in terms of mathematics, that's not much different. So on the left, you see that we can easily generate square waves. You can pack them into some windows. We can define any wavelet in an analytical way. I'm working with a Swiss sound engineer. He's trying to develop a database of super shaped sounds, not in a classical way of making sounds by stacking sinuses and cosines, but really make sounds like they would appear like this. And there are already some digital synthesizers that have, apart from the wave shape, can also be modulated by this. So it's branching out from let's say, from pure shape description to antennas, and now also to wireless and sounds. Now, what is special about this equation is that it's very simple. So there's not, I call this Pythagorean compact, because the structure of this one, the circle and the supercircle, and this one is very much the same. There's a cosine term, there's a sine term, but we had to convert it into, from, let's say, Cartesian to polar, and then adapt it a little bit. But there was something missing. So how can you do that? And it turned out to be that originally, this is Guido Grandi in 1713 wrote a letter to Leibniz, way of representing flowers. Cosine m theta is, and cosine m could be a rational number, and then you get what is called the geometrical flowers of Grandi, or rose curve. And this basically cosine 5 theta was the inspiration for me to do this. But it was also the inspiration to go back, because I realized that if you look at Grandi curves, and if you have cosine theta, for example, if you have this transformation, cosine theta is cosine n theta, but the nth Chebyshev polynomial, and polynomials are very simply defined by this way. You don't need infinite series, you don't need it, just a finite series. Then we can rewrite these terms just in polynomial ways, which makes it much simpler also for computations. Instead of infinite or truncated series for cosines, we can just transform it into a Chebyshev. And Chebyshev is interesting because it's the best possible approximation to functions. These are some developments we did in mathematics, but also for me, it's a kind of unifying way of thinking about shapes in nature. I think a lot about flowers and plants and so on. I'll give some examples later. But for me, there's not much difference if you look at the way you sweep a brain into a world volume, or fiber bundles on the lower right, or some special shapes on the left. So geometrically, we now have a kind of unifying way. Now, having said this, it's very important to a kind of description. This description also need to be matched in a scientific way to multiple, let's say, observations. So it's not enough to say, well, for bamboo, it looks like this, and it's approximately this this exponent. But we have to make sure that we can do it on not only 10, but hundreds or thousands of specimens. And in the past 5 years, we are doing this precisely that. And it turned out to be that I talked about 3 or 4 parameters, but it turns out that with 2 parameters, we can do a lot of things. And that's the question: was a single parameter, the radius defines all the circles. So what can we do with 2 parameters? In the classical way, one would think, yeah, well, you could make an ellipse. But here we can, by playing with the exponents, we can make a lot more shapes. And this is, let's say, with Nanjing Forestry University, collaboration was initiated in 2012. The goal was to test a superformula on real plants and plant parts. And this has resulted in over 20 papers validating transformations or superformula as a methodology. And it all started with the collection of 35,000 leaves from more than 150 species. They have a lot of students in China. I don't have to tell you that. But just by looking at 2 parameters, V and L, we could construct in 2 numbers the shape parameter and a dimension parameter, let's say the length, and the kind of shape, how fixed is it, and what does this do. We could fit all the bamboo leaves that we wanted. So, for example, you will not see many difference, but for a bamboo expert, there's a big difference between all these shapes, and they could be represented. All 10,000 of these leaves represented almost perfectly by the formula in 2 numbers. And it also allowed us to look at, if you look at the leaf shape parameter only, not the size of it, we can clearly distinguish between different species. Just by measuring the width of the length, we can say to which species it belongs, which is in itself remarkable. But then it got tested also, in the next step, it was tested in other leaves. For example, on the left, you see leaves of a shrub, Parotia, from different geographical provenances. They have a bit slightly different leaves, but also you see there that the fit is relatively good. And I'll explain the term. On triangle, at the lower right panel, you see in panel C, in panel A, you see a very C and D, but in the fit in C, what is that? If you compute the area contained in between the gray curve and in the red curve, the area is exactly the same. So while the fit is not perfect, the area is the same. And I'll show that from a geometrical point of view, this is a big advantage of thinking about leaves, because the area of a leaf is it's functional because it determines how much sunlight a leaf can catch. So this we published, for example, this was a best paper award winner for, yes, we have a general leaf area geometric formula exists in plants. And these were, for example, tests conducted in that paper. Now, what is the importance of leaf shape? So I make a remark, other than distinguishing genera, species, and cultivars. For example, I show here examples of begonia, sorry. And some of the images were done by elliptic Fourier analysis. But if you want to have a good approximation, you need to go to almost 200 harmonics. You cannot believe there will be 200 other harmonics. And in my opinion, it does not make sense. Harmonics make sense if you work with strings and all that, but it doesn't make any sense if you work with leaves. So in our case, but we focus on area, not shape or congruence. So if we look at the area, which we take a different glasses, then we see it differently. Also, that the estimation within of the area within the red curve and the area within the gray curve is exactly the same, which means that we can use one simple method to estimate the area of a leaf, and the rest, the shape itself, is not important. Now, going back to square bamboos, so number 2 was the original square bamboo, and all these shapes were tested in the 2015, 2016 timeframes, and it worked for all the bamboos we tested. But last year we tested and we published a paper because the original hypothesis was Lamé curves for square bamboos. Now, last year it was tested on 30 culms, 750 shapes, sections, and each section had 2 shapes. And also here you see that the fit is very well. But what we found something remarkable. So we found that we have super ellipses or sub ellipses. Sub ellipses means exponent smaller than 2 or exponent larger than 2. So in all these shapes, we found a bimodal distribution, but we don't find ellipses. Also in the intersection, we don't find true ellipses or true circles, only a few. Which goes a bit against the grain, because if we look at physics, for example, people try to think about circles and ellipses, for example, in astronomy. But if we look at natural data, we don't find ellipses. They're not approximations of they're trying to be circles. That's something of our current research, because then we went back to let's say the tree rings, and also here we found that there are no true circles. They're not even say approximations of circles. They try to avoid having circles. Remarkable. So in other cases, we used it to look at bending and torsion of petioles and stars. For example, in all these trees, you have also a kind of torsion, which you can track throughout the years, because each of these could be fit with a super ellipse. I will not spend much on this, but what is very important, that testing more than 40,000 biological specimens, including starfish and all that, we found that we could go from an analogy to a scientific methodology tested on 40,000 specimens, and we could do it only with 2 or 3 numbers. We use my formula, but in a reduced way with just 2 or 3 numbers. And that for me is what I call Lamé footprint. Lamé originally thought this would be good to describe crystals, but we find it to be describing many, many shapes in nature. So show a quote from Richard Feynman, so that we have a tendency to accept symmetry as some kind of perfection. And the circle, something perfect. For Kepler, it was not perfect, but And the difference between being a circle and being nearly circle is not a small difference. It's a fundamental change. It's no longer symmetrical, but the data show it's not nearly a circle. So it's not a circle or an ellipse, it's something super elliptic. It's really lamé. Yeah, I'm gonna switch this. So two important questions have also already been answered. So can we find a common measure for square starfish and flowers? Yes, we can. And a single parameter, the radius, defines all circles. So what can we do? Two numbers, that's also clear a lot. Leaves, starfish, and so on and so forth. So, Simone, or just a question, it's now, I've been talking for 1 hour. I will be needing another 10 or 15 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm going to was talking about how my own work was thinking out of the box, but now results in very good scientific methodology and technological methodology. But now I'm going to show how our geometrical lenses should be very different. For example, if we have more quotes, value of pi. So do super circles and super shapes have rotational invariance? And the shapes of bamboo or these wildly different, are they congruent? I will go pretty fast. I will put I will share the presentation.
Fissati.
But if we
no, perché
sorry?
I fisici tendono a ragionare così, sentono di che unità di misura parla e capiscono di che.
Okay, so I don't know. So what is a distance? I think so. We're looking at another way of looking at distances. So definition can be very broad. For example, isochrones. So if you start in the middle and you go for 1 hour by foot or by train, or you can reach very different destinations, and it's also a unit circle. This is very the unit, the spread of the let's say COVID in 1 day or 2 days is also a unit circle. And thinking about distance is very different, but this is actually what we are doing. We are looking at so-called Minkowski distances, but they're basically Euclidean Minkowski distances. The max distance and so on is a special case. What is interesting is that in the 60s and the 70s, experiments were done in education by looking at distance by children from 6 to 8 years old. And they understood all this. And now it's very difficult outside of mathematics and physics to find other ways. You do it in data mining, but then I think people don't really understand what they're doing. But anyway, so the properties for such distances are very much like the Euclidean ones, symmetric, non-negative, triangle inequality, but rotation invariance is not concerned for city blocks. You cannot rotate classically in this way, but I will show that it's different. First of all, I would like to go into isotropic geometry. If we look, for example, at a painting is a visual illusion. So it's wood, some lots of paint on there. And actually, is this Euclidean geometry or not? And what I want to show that it's not Euclidean geometry. And that's very important because everyone uses graphs. So for example, here you have the pound and the years, but these are, let's say, incommensurable quantities. So, and it's not Euclidean because on the right, you see, if you would perform a Euclidean rotation, that would be completely nonsense. So actually, it's an other kind of geometry. So actually, what is it's pictorial space. So the base space for pictorial space, the Euclidean space, and then you have fibers above this space, and then the construction is an affine line, like fibers on a brush, and that creates depth, and this is called isotropic geometry. Projective geometry, but if you think of P going, will become, let's say, parallel. And these will be called fibers over a line. And so that happens that fibers over the Euclidean plane can then have different shapes, can have different the same shadow, let's say. But it's creating let's say, a visual illusion. But we use it daily if we map along a fiber onto a map or a height map. We do it by colors or by heights. But what is important here in this isotropic geometry is that it's a different way of thinking about rotation. So you have three ways of measuring distances. The parabolic way is the more classical way, so from O to E and from E to B and so on. The elliptical way is something like this, like a rotation that we see. And the hyperbolic way is using ratios. I will not go into this because the three ways of measuring rotations are very much more important. So this is the classical way. Elliptic rotation goes like this. This is the unit circle, and it goes with the classical complex numbers. This is also a well-known case, hyperbolic rotations over the hyperbola related to these complex numbers. But parabolic rotation is something very important because if you rotate a line OA to B, then you rotate over a unit circle, which is like this. And this is related to the so-called dual numbers, which is a kind of strange complex number series, but it's a perfectly valid way of measuring rotation. And actually the unit circle is S. And this is also another unit circle. But so the rotation is along this line, not along this line. And in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, this was very common. But this, as I showed in the graphs, this is complete nonsense. But actually a rotation along a fiber makes perfect sense. So this is not a shift, it's basically a rotation around the parabolic circle. And these are called Cayley-Klein geometries. So you have ways of measuring distance, elliptic, parabolic, and hyperbolic. And you have ways of measuring angles, elliptic, parabolic, and hyperbolic. And this gives 9 geometries, 27 if you go into 3 dimensions. And the parabolic way of measuring rotation and the parabolic way of measuring distance gives Galilean geometry. I'm going to skip a few of those things because then I run out of time. So the question was, we're going to focus on what is important in leaves. So we found already, to do it via Fourier series is going to be complicated. What is important is, this is the way of classical Euclidean congruence, but we found that we look at leaves, if we don't focus on shape, if we focus on area, then we find that the red curve and the gray curves have the same area. So in step 1, so what is congruence? So normally you would say this and these are not congruent, but if we look at not the shape, but if you look at area, it's basically the same. And now the next step is that we have different shapes like this and different shapes like this and different shapes like this. Now, how can we geometrically turn the one into the other? So to make the congruence complete. And that's via this isotropic parabolic rotation. If we rotate a leaf along these fibers, like we did before, parabolic rotation, we can rotate this leaf into that leaf. So also, if we have a leaf like this, we can rotate in a leaf like this. Think back of the graph spaces, where parabolic rotations and fibers over a line were important. Here, the whole diversity of leaves turns into variations of one theme area. If we think not about the shape of the, but we focus on area, we can describe it with a simple formula, 2 numbers. And then we can do a parabolic rotation, and area is conserved in this geometry. So the area here and the area here is also the same. So the whole diversity of leaves, looking with different geometrical glasses, is reduced completely to 2 simple principles. And I think that's very important. I have a few more slides and then I will stop. So this is Barbara McClintock, one of my inspirations, Nobel Prize for discovery of transposable elements. Basically, everything is one. there's no way in which you can draw a line between things. What we normally do is making subdivisions, but they are not real. That's actually human classifications and so on. And it's also in our educational system that is full of subdivisions that are artificial. And my work is aimed at really trying to break down these boundaries and show with different ways of looking. And this could be glasses or lenses or telescopes or microscopes to look differently of shapes, not in the classical Euclidean way. And then we find that we have a very fine unifying generalization of the Pythagorean theorem, according to Lamé, suffices to make all these shapes into one principle. So, and the very simple thing is extend the toolbox of Euclid with our generalized Pythagorean theorems, and we're done. So that's all we have to do. And then, and doing that, I have a vivid imagination. Then there's not so much difference between the shape of and some let's say models of cosmic expansion. This by Professor Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize. You can just morph the one into the other, the great and the small. So I think Simone, I will stop here because then I will take up too much time of the next speaker.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that we have time for a couple of questions, if there's any in the room.
Yeah, I will certainly put this presentation on my ResearchGate page, and I will share it also with Simone. So if you can also write me with questions or suggestions or ideas.
I can start with one.
Yes.
What is the best message for doctoral students to expand this soft skill, like thinking outside the box, creativity? What's the message that you feel to give us?
The message is look and observe absorb it as much as you can. My formal education was in Latin and Greek. I learned a lot in philosophy. Then I moved to botany, plant biotechnology. I picked up a lot there. And now I can see a lot of my friends in mathematics. They let's say much stronger than I am, but they like very much the way I can connect things. So and this is one example of how you can connect things, but there are many more examples. Just look, feel, use all your senses. Use your brains. Have an open mind. That's all. And an important thing, read the masters. So listen to your professors. But if you want to know something about Euler, don't read the book about Euler. Read Euler himself. If you want to understand Gauss or Lamé, read about them. Read what they wrote and how they wrote it. As I said, you cannot reduce mathematics or science just to formulas that were developed 200 years ago. You have to understand how difficult it was and what a long path it took. You have to appreciate this and just, that would be my advice. Read the masters, go deep and go wide. So vertical and horizontal.
Thank you, thank you. There's other. We wait. I don't see a question in chat. Maybe. There's one. Where is? Do you think that this superformula could also be used to unfold the shapes of the cortex?
Yeah. That's a huge problem for egg technology, or?
Like from complex volumes.
For EEG or not? So the problem, I should look at this, but there's two answers that come to mind. First of all, we have to stick to the old wisdom that you can, let's say, you can unfold ruled surfaces, onto a plane, but not spheres. Huh? But on the other hand, you can morph a sphere into a cube. And then you can morph the sphere into, let's say, the coordinate system itself. So that's something that we have to think about, how to approach that, but it fits completely in the more modern style of differential geometry, which is differential geometry was previously very local. And now global geometry looks at, it's called submanifold theory. It's how manifolds reside inside higher dimensional manifolds. You could have you could have a sphere inside a Euclidean space or an n-sphere or something. But in this case, you could really fit two things. You could fit a perfect coordinate system to the shape itself, and you could also morph the shape and its coordinate system into the space in which it resides. Could be a Euclidean space, it could be a spherical space. But it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. But I would say, but feel free to write me. Simone can address, so I'm available for questions or follow up discussions. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor, for this beautiful lesson.